All right. So, how many of you guys have to leave before we? Okay. I will abbreviate as much as I can. So let's start with our typical opening question. Why did God decide to create? Now, you know I'm going to ding you if you give me the simple answer. So, go ahead, Kevin.
This is probably the simple answer, but because
somebody thinks that was me dinging you, by the way.
Got dinged.
God is love, and love is fruitful, and so I understand he's like.
Okay, that's not the simple. I mean, that's actually.
He's still totally fruitful on his own. I guess he's just because of his love, he wanted to create more beings who could have the capacity to love him and share his love.
Wow, that's not the simple answer at all.
I think I know what the simple answer is then.
Well, the simple answer is someone will say love, right? They'll go love. But what is it that God actually loved when he created? Because nothing existed yet. What is it that he loved when he created? So you're, Kevin is right on, but what is it actually that he loved?
Himself.
Okay. Talk about it. Everybody just giggled, but
yeah.
Does that make God his cosmic narcissist or what? Why does he love himself?
Because he's perfectly lovable.
All right.
He's not really loving himself like the one person loves the other, and then the love between them is the Holy Spirit. So it's not really narcissistic at all.
Okay. So would it be fair to say that God loves his own goodness, and that because one of the properties of the good is to diffuse itself, right? So what do you do when you have good news?
You want to share it.
You share it, right? The good spreads out, right? And so he wasn't under any sort of impulse to create, and yet because he is good and he loves the good in himself, he decided to create. Okay? With the express purpose, this is where Kevin was dead on, of the first thing is to make his goodness manifest, to make it be seen, and then to make creatures that could actually appreciate it, right? So it's not as if he's just sitting up in heaven going, this is really cool, we watched an aquarium or something. And he's looking down because he's spreading his goodness throughout creation and wants to someone to actually appreciate it with him, okay? So thus, when he gets to the end of creation, what does he say?
It is good.
It is good, very good, right? It doesn't just say it's good, very good. And in fact, it's so good. What's the last day of creation? What does he set aside? Why does he set that day aside? Why is the Sabbath set aside?
To enjoy it.
To enjoy the goodness of it, right? To revel in what God made and the goodness of it. Okay? And the reason, we'll see why this is important in the second half, it then ties back into theology of the body. So the Catechism says, St. Bonaventure explains that God created all things not to increase his glory, but to show it forth and to communicate it. For God has no other reason for creating than his love and goodness. Creatures came into existence when the key of love opened his hand. All right, so everything he creates, is meant to show forth his glory and his goodness. Okay, is that everything equally? How did he do that? Does he give a rock as much of his glory and his goodness as he gives a coffee bean, or as much as he gives a cat, or a man, or an angel, or what? How does that work?
Well, short answer is no, they don't all get the same.
Yeah. So yes, the short answer is that each creature that he created in their own unique way, right? So if you want to learn about an artist, right? If an artist makes one piece of art and you go and look at it, you're like, wow, this is a really good piece of art, but it doesn't tell you anything about the artist, right? For the artist to sort of express himself, he has to make lots of pieces of art. Hopefully he's not that shallow that one piece does it. But he makes lots and lots of pieces of art, and each one in a different way sort of expresses him. So if I want to appreciate Van Gogh, I don't just look at one of his paintings, right? I go and I look at all of them. and then I can begin to see what his view of the world was, and what it would tell me something about the person, right? And so when God created, being an infinite creature and infinitely good, he couldn't put all his goodness into one creature. He spread it out, okay? And actually, the more the merrier, so that each thing that we look and see has a different sort of way of reflecting God's goodness, right? And this goes from the very bottom, from the rock, all the way up to the angels, okay? But each one has more and more and more and more, okay? So there is this sort of hierarchy of creation. All right, and this sort of, you guys, we've talked about this before. But so why this matters is to just first simply understand that that through God, his goodness and the way he created, he made it so that there was this hierarchy. And at the top of the hierarchy, he makes these creatures that both reflect his glory more than the other ones, but then can also appreciate it. All right? All right, so then let's sort of now talk about those special creatures, the angels and mankind, at the top of that ladder. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Like we talk about it, like, oh, that person has dignity because they're made in the image of God. What does that mean, though? What do we mean when we say that?
Does it have intellect and will?
Okay, so they in some way reflect something about God, right, in a unique way. And they reflect, in the case of man and angels, they have intellect and will, so they can reason and they can love, right? Just like God does. Is that the only way, though, that those creatures image God? Knowing what we know about God, right, as this communion of persons, and knowing what we know about the way God created and why he created. So it's not just enough to know creation, to love. There's something more about what did God do with his goodness. He causes the goodness in everything else, right? So to be made in the image of God means both to sort of act like him and have some of his powers of reasoning and willing, but more importantly, for what we're going to talk about, we also have this capacity to cause good in other things that nothing else has, right? Only man with invisible creation can do that. All right? So that idea then is really important for us to understand as we begin to sort of see, well, okay, God is not just reason and will, right? He's not, there's something more going on, okay? And so that's where we're going to sort of take off, and this will now help us dive into theology of the body. So St. Thomas says, the image of God, likewise, as the uncreated Trinity is distinguished by the procession of the word from the speaker and of love from both of these, as we have seen, so we may say that in rational creatures wherein we find a procession of the word in the intellect and a procession of the love in the will, and there exists an image of the uncreated Trinity by a certain representation of the species. All right, well, let's sort of unpack that a little bit, okay? So remember, we're made in the image not just because we're intellect and will, but because we cause good in others, and that must somehow make us more than just individuals. All right. So let's think about this for a second. Okay. So here's this dude, and he's thinking about something. Okay. And you guys know what a PowerPoint idiot I am, right? So this is really sophisticated for me. So you guys should all go like, wow.
How long did you spend on this slide?
I've recycled this so many times. I don't know the first time I did it. I have no idea. But this is like the crown of. This is my sixth day of creation right here. It is good, very good. That's what I've decided. All right, so this is dude, right? He's thinking, right? He's thinking. And so when we think about things, right, the thing we're thinking about sort of is in us. So the thing known is in the knower, right? Not in the same way as it actually exists inside of us, but if we're thinking about a chair, then the chair is somehow inside of us. You guys sort of grasp that? Right? When we think about a thing, or if we think about another person, they're somehow with us as we think about them, okay, in our mind. All right? So that is one of the ways in which we image God. We have this power to think about something and that thing to be in us. So when God thinks about himself, then this perfect being who thinks of a perfect being, okay, what does it mean to be perfect? So remember what I said. When we think about something, or someone, let's start there. When we think about someone, we somehow call them to mind, right? We even use that way of thinking about things or talking about things. Is that a perfect representation of them? What's lacking?
They're not really there.
Their existence, right? So part of perfection is existence, right? And so God, who is perfect, when he thinks of himself, a second person exists, the Word, okay? And now there's two people, or two persons, we'll say, within the Trinity.
They better not start thinking of themselves.
All right. So now, what about when I love? The same thing. When I love, the thing that I love somehow is in me, right? The thing loved is in the lover. The beloved is in the lover. All right. So this for all eternity, God is thinking about himself, contemplating himself, and that contemplation is so perfect that it's a second person. And that second person is the Word. And God is so in love with his goodness that the love between the God and his thought of himself is itself a third person. Okay, so this is the procession of in the intellect and in the will of the three persons of the Trinity. All right, that's like really heavy, right? You guys are all looking like seriously deer in headlights kind of look. So, of course, we don't necessarily grasp it, and this is our way of sort of explaining it. But the point is, we don't have to sort of grasp it fully because God gave us ways to image that. All right, and this is what John Paul II's whole idea is. He says, okay, fine. He says, you know what? Everything reflects God in some way. But how do we grasp when the reflection of God as a communion of persons? Okay, because we know God is not just this solitary figure off in heaven somewhere by himself. So how do we grasp that? Is there an analogy? Is there some way that we can grasp that? And John Paul II says, yes. In this entire world, there is not a more perfect, more complete image of God, unity and community, one in many, than marriage. There is no other human reality which corresponds, more humanly speaking, to that divine mystery. Right? Why would he say that? Why would he say that? We were just literally in our heads a second ago. How did he move from being in our heads to marriage? And how could we possibly know that? Is John Paul II just making this up? Or is he onto something that we all sort of intuitively grasp? And so, what is God's favorite analogy for his relationship with us?
Family of God.
Okay, so family of God, which is related to this, yes. But I think about his relationship with us individually. What? You guys can cheat and look at the slide if you want.
Probably that one.
Okay, so all throughout the Old Testament, Jesus calls himself the bridegroom in the New Testament. Right? There's the wedding of the Lamb, the feast of the wedding of the Lamb at the end of the Bible. The beginning of the Bible, it starts with a wedding. Weddings all in between. Right? The first of Jesus' public ministry, he appears at a wedding. Like pretty important stuff, right? And one of the reasons why we as Christians should be really protective of marriage, to make sure it images that correctly, right? And that's why we are. So, if we say, like we said at the beginning, that everything reflects something of God, then marriage is sort of the par excellence reflection of God. Okay, and that's what John Paul II is getting at with the Theology of the Body. All right. So that's our first point to just sort of understand his motivation. Remember I said when we talked about Humanae Vitae a few weeks ago, I said, well, this was sort of a natural law argument again, or an argument for it. Now what John Paul II wants to do is for us to begin to think theologically. Okay, and that's what Theology of the Body does, as the name sort of but there's obstacles to this, okay? And the first, and this is why marriage is really important. So when when God uses that analogy, like, and he says something like, "For as a young man marries a virgin, your builder shall marry you, and as a bridegroom rejoices in his bride, so shall your God rejoice in you." Why does he use marriage? Let's think about that for a second. Go ahead.
Well, marriage reflects the Trinity because you have sort of like the husband sort of playing the role of the father, loving the son, loving the bride, and then their offspring becomes like, it's sort of like the Holy Spirit, so their love actually becomes like physically a third person.
So I'll play a little devil's advocate. I'm not saying you're wrong, but so why can't love between any two people be like that? Like, why does it? I mean, shouldn't all love be somehow fruitful in some way? Like, if it's true love, remember we talked about last week. We talked about there's always a third thing when two people love each other. Like, there's the lover, the beloved, and the love between them, right? So all love sort of images this. Why marriage, though?
Because the man and woman become one flesh.
Exactly, right? They become one flesh, all right? And so the Catechism says the flesh is the hinge of salvation. We believe in God, who is creator of the flesh. We believe in the Word made flesh in order to redeem the flesh. We believe in the resurrection of the flesh, the fulfillment of both the creation and the redemption of the flesh. All right, so there's a lot of flesh there, right? In a good way, right? Not as if, somebody's wearing something they shouldn't. But what I really want us to sort of grasp, though, is when God married mankind, what did he do? I mean, God really did marry mankind. This is not just an analogy. He took what?
He took on our sin.
He took flesh, right? He took flesh. Like, the marriage between God and mankind is really a one-flesh union, right? When Christ, when the Word becomes flesh, that marriage actually happens. All right? And so now we can sort of now back up and go, wait a second. When I first started thinking about, we've probably heard the term theology thrown around so much that we're like, we don't really question, wait a second, hold on. How can we have a theology, which is the study of God, of the body? Right? How can you have a theology of the body? And what John Paul II wants us to do is go, oh, we can. First of all, because Christ, the second person of the Trinity, took on flesh. So God does now have a body united to him. But also because that we are creatures with flesh, and we are made in the image of God, not just in our souls. Okay, that's what I wanted to move away from, just this idea of intellect and will. It's not just our souls. All right? And so we shouldn't be too surprised then that this would be one of the places that the devil would attack, right? So especially now with this confusion about the human body. Okay? Does it matter? Is it, all throughout, you look at lots of Christian heresies are mostly about that. They're mostly errors about God that lead to errors about man. Okay? And most of those errors have to do with somehow separating the body and the soul. Okay? And what happens when you separate the body and the soul? Man dies, right? And so when we do that, we sort of, we're sort of create sort of almost having this sort of intellectual suicide that leads to real things like a culture of death. All right, so let's talk about why it's actually called a theology of the body, and then we can sort of move around. Okay, so here's what John Paul II says. He says, the body, in fact, and only the body, is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and the divine. It has been created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden from eternity in God, and thus to be a sign of it. All right, what is he saying there? When anyone, if you say someone is a person is made in the image of God, how do you know that? Other than the fact that it's sort of, been pounded into your head and you've always said it, how do you know that? How would you know that? Do I need to rephrase the question? Is it?
I don't know.
Well, you would see them, right? And how do you see a person? in and through their body, right? So in other words, you never see my soul. Do you see my soul? Like, is my soul hanging out right now? Do I need to tuck it in? Or is it that the soul is sort of made manifest in and through the body? So the body's really probably pretty important then, right? I mean, I can be as holy as I want, but if my body's doing something else, then I'm not so holy, am I? Right? So it reveals the person, right? So how do I know that a person is there? I see their body, right? And so what we have to do is first sort of to get rid of this sort of idea where we separate the body and the soul when we look at things, right? We're like, oh, that's just spiritual stuff, right? This other stuff is real life stuff. This is, me working, that's just to feed me, but when I go to church on Sunday, that's when I feed my soul, right? What John Paul II wants us to do is get away from that tendency and that attitude, to begin to look at the person whole, body and soul. Okay, you are your body, you are your soul. You don't have a body, you don't have a soul. You are human beings, have and are both things substantially united together. Okay. All right. So when we begin to sort of think about this, let's now back up one more step and say, okay, well, all right. So you say that God is this communion of persons, and this one person is pouring himself out into the other person, and then these two persons come together and they pour themselves out completely together, and somehow that creates a third person. When I look in the mirror, I don't see that. I don't see how the I am made like that. All right, you guys agree with that? Okay, and that's what he wants to get at. Okay, because that's utterly and completely false. All right. So he says sexuality is by no means something purely biological, but concerns the innermost being of the human person as such. It is realized in a truly human way only if it is an integral part of the love by which a man and a woman commit themselves totally to one another until death. So, you guys recall when Adam first sees Eve, what he does? You guys remember what he does? He's
this one at the last.
Yeah, he looks at her and he goes, finally. And not just in the sense of like, okay, seriously, I've been like looking all around and I've been on so many blind dates. And he looks and he goes, finally, this, after looking at all those animals, this is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. What did he see in Eve that made him think that? Okay, but why did he think, well, this is just another one of those creatures, although this one I can talk to. What made him think that she was somehow different?
She contained a part of him.
Okay, so it certainly contained a part of him, right? There's a hint. But what else?
She was complimentary.
Yeah, right? Complimentary in what way? Like she had lots of other virtues. She happened to really like to clean the house. Or was this complementarity bodily too? So when he looked at himself and looked at her, and he's like, I was made for that. Right? Would he have known that without a body, without her having a body? So her body and his body revealed to each of them the fact that they were made for gift. Right? The man looks at himself and goes, oh, I'm supposed to make a gift of myself. The woman looks at herself and goes, oh, I'm supposed to be a gift. I'm supposed to receive the gift. All right? But if they were just two souls bumping into each other, would they know that, right?
Aren't the souls complementary too?
Yeah, they absolutely are. But there's no way visually for Adam to see that, right? So if somehow she's like this feminine soul in this androgynous body, he's going to keep going, I don't know. Right? You keep telling me this, but I'm not sure. Right? But he sees in and through her body that he was made for her. Right? And he rejoices, right? He's like, the meaning of my life, to give myself away. Right? And that's why the body becomes so important. And again, to go to the flip side of that, right? We begin to think about, okay, so if I'm planning this sort of counterattack against man, what's one of the things I want to attack? His view of his body, right? And for the woman, the view of her body. All right, and this goes back to what we talked about last week about shame and shamelessness and all those things, right? How they were naked without shame. which we'll talk more about next week or in 2 weeks. But that's the idea, okay? And so John Paul II said, part of the reason why people have responded the way they have to Humanae Vitae is because that idea, they haven't gotten it. They don't understand that. Right? And so he said, I'm going to help them to see, okay? And this is why George Weigel called theology of the body a theological time bomb, all right? And I don't think he was using I don't think he was being using a lot of hyperbole here. I think he's right. I think when it finally gets grasped, as we talked about in the first week, it's complicated. And as you sort of dive into it, you begin to grasp what he's trying to do. And it's not as complicated. But so we have to look at, we really have to look at it in light of the timing of it. So we have to start to look around at the culture around us and begin to think about, okay, why now? Why does God reveal this now? Why is this so important for now? What's going on in the world around us? Why is this the answer? Why is this the time bomb that's ticking, getting ready to go off? And to do that, we have to sort of look around us a little bit, okay? So how did we get here, all right? All right, so you guys have all seen this before, right? I think, therefore I am. Is that true?
If it's not, then it's basically meaningless to ask any other questions.
Okay, so you think it's true. You think, I think, therefore I am is true.
I just think that you have no way of... It's one of those questions where I was reading... C.S. Lewis talks about this. If your first question is, does reason exist? And you answer no, then you're done. And we have signs all around us that we're not done, so it's probably pretty likely that it does exist. Same thing with this.
Okay, so what happens to, for example, so René Descartes, I'll give you this sort of, René Descartes is a 15th century philosopher, and he's sort of, if you take the two most influential philosophers throughout history, is probably Socrates, maybe Plato, Aristotle, and René Descartes, all right? And the reason is because everything we believe in modernity is based on this premise, all right? And then we're going to talk a little bit about, so let me just play devil's advocate to what Jean-Claude said. So if I'm asleep and I'm no longer thinking, have I ceased to exist?
It's a if then, not a if and only if.
I think it's more accurate to say thinking is an indication of existence, not a cause of it.
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right.
That was a logical fallacy.
Well, let's talk about the implications of this. So I didn't say it wasn't true. I just said it can be as building a foundation can be a problem, right? Because where did you guys have heard me quote Aquinas enough. What did Aquinas base his philosophy on? Objective reality, things outside, right? He always looks at the essence of things, the nature of things, and says, okay, let's unpack this and see what it is. All right? What Descartes is doing is says, no, you don't have to look outside. Reality is not out there. Reality is in here. All right? And so he starts with saying, okay, well, I exist because I can do that. Because I can look inside, and inside is where I get my reality from. All right? So let's tease out some of the implications of this. I sort of hinted at it already when I asked the question. All right, so the first implication is, in essence, I am my mind, okay? And so immediately now we've separated body and soul. Okay, if everything is inside, then, and I can make up my own reality based on that, then the body really doesn't matter anymore, does it? It's only my soul. It's only my thinking thing, right? Do you guys think there's anything in sort of modern worldviews that believe that? I mean, the whole transgender movement is based upon that, right? Is I get to make up what my own reality is. Forget about the biology. I feel like this thing. Okay.
There are also people who, good thoughts cause things to happen.
Yeah, there is that, even that, right? As if, but there's also, what it contains within it is the roots of moral relativism too, right? Because I get to decide what is good and what is bad, all right? What's that?
I don't know what else Descartes says on this, but I know that's not necessarily correct. Because my understanding of the quote is he's basically saying the only thing I can confirm to exist is my own consciousness. And I know it exists because I'm thinking about it.
Okay.
But
But
I don't take any issue with his quote directly. I think you take it too far, you can get these things.
You're saying like how people could use that down the line.
No, I'm just saying like that statement right there saying that thinking is a sign that I exist.
But that's not what he's saying, though. Like, I am sort of cleaning it up a lot, like not giving you guys like quote after quote after quote. He's not just saying that, he's got a whole bunch of things. Like
There's additional context.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying that essentially he's like, okay, reason is democratized. Everyone can think that everyone thinks the same. And if I can just find this one method where, there'd be no difference of opinion if, like the scientific method, we had a philosophical method. And then he sort of comes to it and he goes, okay, well, here's I'm going to have this total skepticism about everything. I'm going to start with no assumptions, and I'm going to move to here. And what he says is, okay, well, I can't even assume I exist. So I need proof that I exist. All right? And that's what he says is his proof for existence. Okay? So what he does is then flips the way we normally think of things, which you're saying is that action follows from existence, right? That being is before doing. All right? What he's saying is that doing is before being. All right? And that is sort of...
I didn't read it as a cause. I just read it as
that way.
That's because it's not contextual.
like
Okay.
There's a long behind it if you actually read it.
Yeah, I mean, there's more to it than this. I'm trying to sort of... I will just say, so what he did was he turned us into... Remember we talked about objectivity, subjectivity? He turned us into where subjectivity was now sort of the master of objectivity. Okay? And so... okay, so in that sort of implication, what we talked about is what happens to the human body when in this viewpoint, right? Where I become sort of my thoughts, and I become my soul, or I become my mind. The body becomes something, just an add-on, right? Something that's convenient, a vehicle, however you want to look at it, okay? And the point is that the body and the soul can't be separated. So any sort of dualism, the church would say, is the wrong way to look at mankind. All right? So let's go sort of, maybe we can sort of back up just a little bit and just talk about why this causes things like puritanical beliefs, right? Where it's I just got to grind it out with my soul is primary, my body doesn't matter. It's all about my soul, and this sort of puritanical way of looking at reality, versus, because that's an error. Remember, errors only come in twos, right? So this sort of angelism, where I'm trying to be an angel and ignore my body, and then the opposite error always comes with it, and that's sort of to see ourselves as just animals. Okay, and so this tendency of, well, it's only the body. I don't really have a soul. And so what John Paul II then does is he tries to take this turn to the subject and somehow wed it with what the church has classically always taught. Okay, so he tries to take Descartes, who says, I think, therefore I am, and Aquinas, who says, I am, therefore I think. And he tries to say, okay, well, maybe we can somehow wed these two. And he says, in thinking, I reveal that I exist. All right, and now you see the primacy of why the body becomes so important. All right, I promise that's the last of the philosophy. Some of you look like you felt it. Yes?
I don't get how that's different from the first one.
So the revealing, so remember what I said. So for something to be revealed, does it have to exist first? Okay, so...
One is just saying that thinking actually caused his existence,
Yeah.
which is not.
So the key is in the therefore.
They were taught to think.
I think, therefore I am. So I think, then I will conclude that I exist. Okay? Does that make sense? And so what he's trying to do here is go, okay, this is so prevalent in the modern world, this sort of turn to the subject, that we have to sort of we have to find a way to begin to speak that language. Right? We have to begin to sort of look at and go, okay, yeah, in a certain sense, and this is why all of you are sort of not grasping this initially, and that's okay, because we've a fish doesn't always grasp that he's swimming in water, right? Or probably never really grasps it. But the point is that if we can sort of nuance this a little bit, we can begin to speak the same language, right? And this is where what's called his personalism comes in. I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to actually give you an example that you all already know. All right. So in making moral judgments, personalist philosophy does not look first at either natural or divine law, but takes the truth about man as a starting point. Yet it discusses the nature of the person by referring to subjective experience. In this way, it is understandable to modern rationalist thinking because it addresses ethical questions from inside of man. Because it is wedded to the objective truth about what man is, this truth does not differ from the divine or natural law. It is simply more accessible to man because it relates to his direct experience. All right, I just want you guys to have that definition so that when he's going to, this is what he bases everything on, okay? So let's talk about what everything we did last week was this. When we had a really sort of involved discussion because everything that he talked about in love and responsibility, you were like, yeah, I've experienced that, right? And in the experience, you were like, wait, this says something about what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man. Oh, right? So he took the truth about what men and women are, and then he looked at experience and said, does this experience tell us something about what and who you are? Right? So what he always tries to do, which I think we've talked about before, what he always tries to do is take objective reality and wed it with subjective experience. All right, so that big, long definition is just that. So he says, okay, look, does this ring true with you, right? And for modern men and women, that is the way in which to explain things to them, right? So what he wants us to sort of do is to begin to put more weight on experience, okay? Not to the sort of detriment of objective reality, but to experience objective reality as it really is. And then to look at it and go, well, what does this say about me? Okay? What does it say about me that I experience shame? Right? Well, it tells me that I am infinitely valuable, right? And I can't really give myself, I can't just be taken away, I have to give myself away. And so there's all these things. He looks at the subjective experience and says, what does it tell us, right? And you think about, what do many people what is their problem with the Catholic Church in many ways? They're like, this is too many rules, right? It's too abstract. But what John Paul II says, no, it's not too abstract. In fact, it relates exactly to your life as you live it. And so he starts with the most important relationship that most of us have, and that's marriage, and says, here, let's look at what it is objectively. Let's look at the subjective experience, and let's wed those two things together and actually learn how to live out the image of God that we are. All right? So the purpose of theology of the body, if the narrative of the creation of man and the two versions, the Elohist and the Yahwist, which we'll talk about next time we meet, enables us to establish the original meaning of solitude, unity, and nakedness, it thereby enables us also to find ourselves on the ground of an adequate, he's going to use this term a lot, an adequate anthropology, which tries to understand and interpret man in what is essentially human. All right? So what his purpose is to what he says is to create an adequate anthropology. For us to understand what it means to be men and what it means to be women, right? So he doesn't just go, okay, well, like St. Thomas Aquinas says, okay, well, man is a rational animal, right? And he means men and women when he says man, right? But what John Paul II says, okay, well, what about the fact that men and women have different bodies? Like, should their experience be exactly the same? I mean, we already know the answer, right? Like, again, and you can see how this could, even the question of, going back to the transgender thing, like, how does a guy who's struggling, how does he know what it actually feels like to be a woman that he could say, I feel like I'm a woman? Right? That's why the biology matters, right? Where you go and you say, wait a second, hold on. Like, the experience of being a man is in and through your body. the experience of being a woman is in and through your body. They can't be separated. So we can look at man objectively, the human person, or we can come the other way and say, well, how do men and women experience life and love and all those things? And what does their body tell them about that? Okay? All right, does that make sense? All right, so when he develops this adequate anthropology, we're almost done, he basically takes what he calls a triptych. He takes 3 words of Christ in the gospel, and he looks at the way that things were before the fall. He calls this original man. The way things are now, he calls this fallen and redeemed man. And the way things will be, he calls this eschatological man. Okay? And after he develops this, after we learn what and who we are, he says, okay, how are we supposed to live? And so the last 3, he talks about celibacy for the kingdom, the sacramentality of marriage, and then love and fruitfulness. All right? So that's what we're going to do. So next time we meet, we'll talk about the way things originally were. So this is sort of the next 6 times we meet will be each one of these 6 things. All right. All right, questions? Yes.
So when you were talking about how humans are composite beings, you said that our souls and bodies can't be separated because we're humans. So does that mean that at the point of death we're no longer human?
Yeah, so this is one of those open questions. So what St. Thomas says, he says, obviously the soul can survive death, right? Because it has an operation that doesn't depend on the body, right? Abstraction.
It's no longer human at that point.
Yeah, it's still a human soul, but it's a form without matter. And what that actually means, he's like, I don't know. Is it, Pope Benedict tries to answer the question. He says, well, in the book of Revelation, it talks about how the souls of the just are under the altar. And he says, well, the souls of the just are sharing the body of Christ so that they can still perform human operations. St. Thomas said he doesn't sort of go one way or the other. He just says, well, since there are operations that a soul can do without a body, maybe they just do those operations. But it's sort of, I don't know what it's like to experience life without a body. Yeah, we get the body back so that we become fully human. But even with a soul without a body is something, I don't want to say grotesque, but something not natural, right? And so, that's a lot of ways. That's why any sort of philosophy or religion that sort of those two things aren't united. Well, you go, well, what is that now? That's not a human being any longer. But yeah, that's not really a question we know for sure. But that's the idea.